Greetings, Pathfinders, and welcome back to the Absalom Archives. I apologize if my voice is a little rougher today. I am still getting over COVID, but we must press on, and that means today we'll be diving into the history of Korvosa, the largest city in Varisia. We covered a good amount of this information in the Varisia video, but today we'll be going into a much deeper dive into the city itself. It's an incredibly important site in the region's history, and it's also on the cusp of change. Our year is 4708, and a shift in power has occurred that will change the fate of Korvosa forever. But we'll have time for that later, when we draw back the curtains on a certain Crimson Throne. For now, let's get straight into things with Korvosa's early history. Korvosa is a little over 300 years old, which is pretty young for a city. It began life as a colony of Cheliacs, but its true history begins long before Cheliacs even existed. Before there was Korvosa, there was Zin Eurythnia, the city of lust. The capital of Eurythnia, one of the 7 regions that make up the ancient kingdom of Thassalon, Zin Eurythnia was ruled by runelord Sortion, an immortal wizard who specialized in magical enchantments. While a fascinating and influential figure, Sortion is only mildly relevant to our history today. Most of Eurythnia was destroyed in Earthfall, with only some of Sortion's more magically reinforced monuments surviving to the present day. Several of them are scattered around Varisia, but today we'll focus on one of them, the pyramid that would one day be known as Grand Mastaba and later Castle Korvosa. Now, we don't know exactly what the pyramid was used for in Eurythnia, but I have a reasonable guess. It was probably Sortion's palace, or if not, her main workplace and laboratory. As Earthfall approached, each of the runelords prepared their own way to survive the collapse. Sortion went for the more popular route, which was creating her own demi-plane where she would wait in stasis until things were more stable. For her alarm clock, she went with a complex system that would slowly awaken her by funneling rare arcane blood samples into her, slowly returning the runelord to our world. Assisting her in this is a clan of loyal vampires who would remain in torpor below the pyramid of Grand Mastaba and make sure things ran smoothly. Things did not ran smoothly. Sortion's complex was buried far below the structure and designed to be nearly impregnable, and indeed, the runelord of Lust's chambers have remained unpregnated. For whatever reason, Sortion never woke up, and the site's original purpose faded into myth. The Shawanti treated the site as a sacred place, their cultural memory of the runelords twisted with time. The pyramid, which they called Mashka Sat Puyahok, would be a gathering place for Skalar Kwa Shawanti. The clans established a camp at the base of the pyramid and guarded the site for generations. Then, for a very long time, nothing much happened. The Shawanti continued their way of life for thousands of years, waiting out the Age of Darkness, the rise of Eredin, and the reign of the Whispering Tyrant. After the Shining Crusade, the nation of Ustalav struggled to recover from Tarbafon's tyrannical rule. Making this harder was the neighboring nation of Belkson, which stood between them and Varisia. The orcs of Belkson, who'd been part of Tarbafon's forces, continued raiding Ustalav's western border, specifically the county of Tamravena. The people repelled the orcs again and again, but this wasn't sustainable. Around 4042 Absalom Reckoning, the ruler of Tamravena, Count Andachi, turned to the gods for salvation. Unfortunately, he picked Zon Cathan. The god of suffering answered his prayers with a general of great skill to drive the orcs away, Kazavan. Now, Kazavan did drive the orcs off, and then started building his own tyrannical base of power, Castle Scarwall. His brutally trained soldiers hunted down orcs, Shawanti, and anyone that came to make peace with them. Count Andachi attempted to correct his mistake and was easily defeated, publicly executed in front of his officers, who were impaled alive on a thorn tree. For over another decade, Kazavan ruled the area, growing in power. Part of the secret to his success was his true nature. Kazavan was not a human, but a dragon in disguise. Though ancient and mighty as a dragon, Kazavan seemed to prefer living and fighting as a human for some reason. So secretive was he that only a select few in his forces actually knew his true nature prior to his defeat. In 4063 AR, a group of heroes stormed Castle Scarwall and killed Kazavan. Mostly. The dragon was a powerful, unholy champion of Zon Cathan, and his soul would not stop or rest. His vile bones sought to knit themselves back together and reform the dragon over and over. The heroes, seeking a way to stop him forever, divided the body into 7 parts and took each of them away, so they could never reform. Each part has become its own vile, powerful artifact, with their own history to tell. Kazavan's skull, claws, horns, ribs, tailbone, and wings all have their own history, and we may revisit them someday, but today we'll discuss his teeth and the artifact that holds them, the Crown of Fangs. Among the heroes that struck Kazavan down was a Shawanti named Koja Eyes of Flame. After defeating the dragon, he carried the fangs home with him to Varisia, where he sought the wisdom of all the Shawanti Kwa. After meeting with each of them, he traveled to the pyramid of Grand Mastaba and entered its depths with the fangs, to seal them away forever. Neither he nor the artifact ever emerged again. See, this ties back in, that wasn't just a random tangent. The Shawanti continued on, generations passing as they guarded the pyramid, only partially aware of what lurked in its depths. Thankfully, the crown was not placed deep enough inside to influence or call to Sortion or any of her vampiric allies. That could have been a disaster. Instead, they lay quietly entombed there for now. Which ends off our preamble. Now we move on to Korvosa's proper founding, which means we turn our eyes southward to the nation of Cheliax near the height of their power. The founding of Fort Korvosa. In 4404 AR, King Halleck IV of Cheliax offered a charter to Field Marshal Korvosa for the creation of a colony in the untamed wilderness of Varisia. Obviously, the location was inhabited by the Shoanti and the Varisians that had been living there for centuries, but the Chelish didn't consider that claim real because it got in the way of all the colony building they wanted to do. When Korvosa, the man, began to marshal his forces, a rival from the navy named Mercatio Chiemelu petitioned the king for a similar charter in order to outperform his rival. The two men would fight for funding over the next year before setting out, eager for glory and fame they would earn on the frontier. By 4406, both groups had set things in motion. Korvosa's forces would push through the blood-sworn Vale, clashing with the Shoanti several times and surviving a brutal winter. As spring arrived, they moved farther into Varisia, though they wouldn't get to the site of Grand Mastaba just yet. They would instead construct a palisade along a riverbank and regroup, fending off more and more Shoanti forces. We'll come back to what happened to them in a bit. Before we keep going, I think it's important to establish the geography of the area now. Conqueror's Bay separates Cheliax to the south and Varisia to the north. On the edge of the bay, which makes up the west coast of Varisia, there's another, smaller little bay that sits at the mouth of a river. The Shoanti called the river Mashkapiki, while the colonists would eventually call it the Jigare River, after the Chelaxian explorer who would chart its course. The river makes kind of a curving double bend before entering the bay, creating a small jut of land that you can see here on the map. North of that is a tiny island separated by narrow bands of the river to the north and south. This island would be the first site settled by the Chelish forces, but it wouldn't initially be Korvosa's people, it would be Chiamelu's. Chiemelu actually had a pretty big advantage over Korvosa because he was a naval officer. That meant he could travel by ship, which would be faster than overland travel and more capable of retreat and repositioning along the coast. Joining Chiemelu was his financial backer, the Chelish explorer Montlarian Jigare. A member of the wealthy House Jigare, we don't know exactly what his position was in the house, though I guess he wasn't extremely high up since he was allowed to just sail out to the frontier and stomp around. When Chiemelu's forces landed at the mouth of the river, Jigare took a portion of their forces with him to map the river and chart its course. The remaining forces stayed behind to set up a colony and were immediately attacked by the Shoanti in the region. Used to the terrain and capable of outmaneuvering the larger Chelish ships with their smaller canoes, the Shoanti forces frightened Chiemelu into abandoning his position. He left several marines behind on the island, sacrificing their lives to save his own. Among them was a man named Waden Endrin, who we'll want to keep an eye on. While most of the ships complied with the retreat order, one ship, the Merciless, stayed. Under the command of Captain Kira Palin, her sailors and the remaining marines survived a brutal siege by the Shoanti people, fending off attacks from the mainland for months. Their salvation came in the forms of Jigare and Korvosa. Montlarian had successfully mapped the river to its source in the Mindspend Mountains and was returning when he came across Field Marshal Korvosa. Based on the timeline, it's likely that Jigare's group moved up the river in late winter or early spring before Korvosa's troops had gotten moving from their winter camp. Once the two men met, they agreed to join forces and journey to the coast. Fending off Shoanti attacks, the combined group found an island under siege, barely holding on. They punched through the Shoanti forces and met up with the Marines, who had only a dozen surviving members at this point. These reinforcements broke the Shoanti siege, giving the settlers a reprieve. Korvosa promoted Waden Endrin to commander and placed him in charge of the group's defenses. Now free from the constant attacks, the colonists began construction of a fort, which they would name Fort Korvosa in honor of their savior. Meanwhile, the island would go on to bear Endrin's name to this day. Now, during this time, Admiral Chiemelu wasn't just sailing around doing nothing, though that seems about the level of competence we could expect from him. That might have actually been better, considering how his story ends. Instead, his forces founded a settlement near the mouth of Conqueror's Bay. His choice of terrain was rather poor, though, being a wide beach that would be difficult for his people to defend. After everything had settled on Endrin Isle, Chiemelu sailed back to Cheliax, intent on revenge against Palin for defying his orders. He attempted to have her court-martialed, but both Korvosa and Endrin were able to intervene on her behalf. In a rare monarchical Chelish W, King Halleck IV demoted Chiemelu, granting control of his forces to Chiemelu's first mate, Veldrain. With the colony site finally established, the Chelish settlers started gathering what they could from Varisia, sending ships back to Cheliax loaded with goods that they had acquired. Field Marshal Korvosa would be chosen as Lord Magistrate of Fort Korvosa, in a classic Planet/King Vegeta situation. Waden Endrin would found the Sable Company, a group made up of the other surviving Marines who would dedicate themselves to battling the Shoanti. The company still exists to this day and are famous for their hippogriff mounts and brutal tactics. The Chelish reinforcements and the Sable Company raids kept the Shoanti away from the settlement, which allowed Fort Korvosa to stabilize and begin growing, though it wasn't without issues. The first big shakeup would occur in 4410, when Field Marshal Korvosa died. Montlarian Jigare was appointed to the Lord Magistrate position, which Korvosa had held since the settlement's founding. This change in leadership was relatively smooth, given Jigare's close association with the other prominent founding members of the colony. But while Fort Korvosa was able to weather the change, the settlement of Chiemelu was not so lucky. Its location made it quite vulnerable, and this year the Shawanti raids were able to assault and destroy the entire settlement, with no survivors. Captain Veldrain, fed up with their former captain's bullshit, chastened them for their many blunders that caused this. They would establish a new settlement, named Veldrain, because that's just how we're naming stuff now, in a nearby natural harbor. Though closely associated with Korvosa, the settlement would remain independent for the next few years. What followed were 5 years of relative quiet. In 4415, Waden Endrin retired as fort commander, replaced by Kira Palin. At some point, the two of them started a relationship. As far as we know, they never formally married. Given their various duties keeping them far apart much of the time, that does make sense. We don't even know when the relationship started, though my personal theory is that it slow burned for a while before fully igniting a few years from now. Before that happens, we have the Battle of Veldrain in 4416. Details are scarce, but it was likely against the Shawanti, and since Veldrain still exists, they likely won. The biggest result of this would be Fort Korvosa officially declaring Veldrain to be one of its holdings. This is significant, marking the point where Korvosa goes from being one of Varisia's settlements to being the heart of its colonization effort. In 4417, Montlarian Jaeger died, with Waden Endrin taking the position of Lord Magistrate. In my opinion, this is when he and Kira Palin really started ramping up the romance, but again, that's just mine. Speaking of Palin, in 4419 she established Palin's Cove, a settlement at the mouth of the Falcon River to the northwest of Korvosa. Originally, this location was used by the Shawanti as a launch site for boat raids. Palin's Cove was temporary fortifications designed to stop this, but would become its own settlement, and by next year would get regular supplies and reinforcements from Veldrain and Fort Korvosa. For the next 9 years, not a whole lot of note occurs. In 4423, representatives from the Dwarven Sky Citadel of Yanderhof arrived in Korvosa. This would provide more legitimacy for the Chelish colony turned fledgling city-state, as well as establishing an overland trade route with a very stable partner. Oh, and 2 years earlier, Kira Palin and Waden Endrin welcomed twin children into the world, Lucian and Brianna Endrin. There's also one more birth we need to talk about, but that requires us to zoom back in time just a little bit. In 4408, Alika Epikena was born. She was in fact the first child born that year in the fort, and possibly the first child born in Fort Korvosa at all. Alika was born a seer, blessed by Pharasma with the ability to look into the future. Her powers were further elevated by studying the Varisian tradition of harrowing, an act that involves using a deck of cards to predict the future. As she grew up, Alika employed this ability in the defense of Fort Korvosa, predicting Shawanti raids with great accuracy and allowing the colonists to keep the fort safe for quite a long time. But eventually, she saw the one thing that every seer dreads: her own death. On the 13th of Neth, the equivalent of November in the Galarian calendar, in 4429, the Shawanti struck the strongest blow against the colonists since the founding of Fort Korvosa. They assaulted Endrin Isle and attacked the fort, starting a blaze that would be known as the Great Fire. Alika had seen this outcome and warned Waden Endrin, who had heeded her warnings and requested assistance from Cheliax. These reinforcements wouldn't arrive in time. Most of Fort Korvosa burned to the ground. The blaze killed roughly 25% of the population, including Waden Endrin, Kira Palin, and Alika Epikena. In an alternate history where the Chelish forces arrived a little later, or didn't arrive at all, the Shawanti might have repelled the Chelish colonists entirely. But that would not be the case. The flotilla from Cheliax arrived 1 week after the fire. Their reinforcements kept the Shawanti from capitalizing on Korvosa's weakness. While this wouldn't trigger an all-out war just yet, it does mark a turning point in the history of Korvosa. Fort Korvosa was no longer a secure landing point for expeditions further into Varisia. If Cheliax wanted to keep the wealth flowing, they needed to fully secure the location. This would take a few years because the fort would need to be rebuilt. The wooden construction of the old fort wouldn't do, they'd need something more sturdy. And so in 4432, construction of a stone fort began. During this time, the Sable Company Marines recruited heavily from the reinforcements, and the Korvosan Guard was founded to protect the settlement and serve as a military force. Korvosa's new goal was deceptively simple. Right now, they were isolated on Endrin Isle, dependent on their naval prowess and hippogriff mounts to make any headway. So the obvious solution is to get a foothold on the mainland. The problem is that the Shawanti were well entrenched around Grand Mastaba, and while ships are great for moving troops onto the beach, they aren't much use after that. The Sable Company Marines were definitely a strong strike force, but they work better in skirmish battles, where their mobility and aerial advantage showed a lot more. Taking the shore would be a long and bloody affair. In 4435, the first Battle of Main Shore was fought, with the Chelish establishing a foothold. However, this wouldn't last, as 3 years later, in 4438, the second Battle of Main Shore would see the Shawanti push the Korvosans back to Endrin Isle. By this point, the stone fort was complete, making Endrin Isle a very defensible position. An interesting aspect of this back and forth is the difference in each side's resources. The Shawanti lived in the area. They had the home field advantage as defenders. However, now that Fort Korvosa was rebuilt and stronger than ever, pushing the Chelish out of the area completely would be very difficult, especially because this battle took place on the coast, and the Chelish navy had a bigger advantage there. Now, these battles all took place before the proper discovery of gunpowder, so the ships wouldn't have been able to launch cannon barrages, but magic is more than capable of filling that gap. In 4442, the lines had slowly shifted forward for the Korvosans, gaining back the shore in the Third Battle of Main Shore and beginning construction of the first permanent fortifications. The Shawanti lost the shore entirely and were firmly pushed back to Grand Mastaba. Between 4442 and 4446, the Shawanti continued to launch offensive raids against the Korvosan front, but the colonists were able to hold the shoreline. In 4445, they completed the first bridge from Endred Isle to the mainland, and that was a big turning point. Now that might seem like it creates a big choke point, but so are gangplanks of a ship, and those make fighting retreats a lot harder. A bridge also allows for undisrupted supply and reinforcement. The next 3 years would see Grand Mastaba sieged by the Korvosans before victory in 4449 claimed the structure for the colonists and drove the Shawanti out entirely. The tribes wouldn't be able to mount any kind of counterattack on the colonists for over a decade. And it's here we transition Korvosa from a colony being established into a city being built. Now that the immediate military threat was gone, Korvosa had to deal with more internal issues, like setting up a government. As a Chelish colony, Fort Korvosa based itself on the Chelish government and was ultimately under the control of the Chelish royal family. At this time, that would have been Emperor Fane II, who replaced his father when the old monarch died in 4437. Fane, and most of Cheliax's rulers going forward, paid little attention to Fort Korvosa, viewing it as a backwater colony useful only for the money that it brought in. The nobility had a slightly different view of things. Yes, it was still a backwater not fit for, quote, proper society, but a down-on-their-luck family could always try to reverse their fortunes using the colony. After all, the Jaguar family had become a prominent house in Korvosan society, and the Endren family was elevated to noble status by Emperor Fane in 4456. So, there's some upward mobility there. The history of other Korvosan houses are a little bit less concrete, but from what I could find, there were at least 7 major houses in the city at this time. We just touched on Endred and Jaguar, and the other 5 were House Croft, House Bromathian, House Arcona, House Fiamio, and House Ornelos. We know the least about House Croft, only that they are traditionally a military house and that they would claim land for themselves on the southern mainland a little later on in our timeline. House Bromathian is the second house elevated by the Emperor for the actions of their founder. In 4457, Nevik Bromathian sacrificed his life to save Wade and Endren from Shawanti assassins. For this act of bravery and self-sacrifice, his family was elevated to noble status. They retain a close tie to House Endren to this day, and their leaders are frequently members of the Korvosan Guard and the Sable Company. You could say the two houses have a bromathance. Laugh, I'm funny. House Ornelos moved their family holdings from Cheliax to Varisia in 4441 after numerous slights from Emperor Fane. The head of the family, Volshinek Ornelos, was known as the Immortal Lord. We'll get into that title a little later on. He had been good friends with the previous Chelish emperor and was one of the most trusted advisors to the throne up until Halleck IV's death. Halleck's son Fane was only interested in promoting his own sycophants, and his dismissal drove House Ornelos to Korvosa, where they would go to found one of its most important institutions, the Academy. Speaking of later importance, House Fiamio doesn't have much presence right now, but it'll be quite impactful in a couple years. The last noble family we'll discuss is House Arcona. The house was one of the oldest in Korvosa, predating even the founding of Cheliax. However, by 4458, House Arcona had become nearly destitute. In a desperate gamble, Lord Gareth Arcona and his brother Jenkson took a ship named the Reprieve and set sail for the distant land of Vudra. It would take 3 years for the ship to return, and the trip was a massive success for both of them. The men returned with enough exotic goods and connections to make Arcona the second wealthiest house in Korvosa, just after House Jaguar. What happened on the voyage changed the two, and upon their return, both Gareth and Jenkson would indulge in almost any vice you could think of. 1 year after the Reprieve returned from Vudra, the Shawanti would resume their organized attacks against Fort Korvosa. 4462 would mark the start of the Last Shawanti War, which saw Korvosa attacked by an army of 2 Shawanti clans, the Sklarqua and the Skoenqua. This army was led by a warrior named Galstak. He would go on to be known as Galstak's 7 Deaths, as over the course of the war he would die and be resurrected 7 different times. His army raided the countryside and besieged both Korvosa and Palin's Cove. The war lasted 26 years and only ended when the Korvosan Guard killed Galstak for an 8th time, while keeping possession of his body to prevent another resurrection. With this defeat, the Shawanti would cease to be a major threat to Korvosa, though the tribes remain hostile to the Chelish settlers to this day. Korvosa was not idle during the war, continuing to grow and expand as much as it could under these conditions. Notably, it would found 2 higher institutions of learning during this time. In 4473, Lord Volshinek Ornelos founded the Academy, the premier wizard college of Korvosa. Though it taught magic of all kinds, the school specialized in spells that conjured and summoned extraplanar beings. This specialty has resulted in Korvosa having an unusually large number of imps roaming the streets, conjured as familiars by the wizards of the Academy, and left to roam, either when their masters moved on to better familiars or died. Keep in mind, this is before Cheliax transitioned to devil worship as its official religion. The second institution was founded the same year the last Shawanti War ended and marks the first mention of House Lorong. Renowned in Cheliax as tutors and educators of noble children, a member of the house named Lady Jessa Lorong would found the University of Korvosa in 4488. Unlike the Academy, which had a magical focus, the University of Korvosa was concerned with the more mundane education of Korvosa's upper class. Lastly, in 4483 during the Shoanti War, the brothers who led House Arcona to success mysteriously disappeared, leaving the house to be run by a previously unknown son and daughter. This began a tradition the house has followed ever since. The head of the house is always a lord and attended by a relative who acts as their close right hand and the face of the house. While the head is patriarchal, this relative can be of any gender. This initial disappearance and inheritance nearly split the house in two, though thankfully every subsequent generation has weathered the change in power a little bit more smoothly. At this point, we are only 19 years from Korvosa's centennial. With the Shoanti beaten back and the construction of Castle Korvosa atop Grand Mastava having been largely complete, the current Lord Magistrate, Rensev Ornelos, felt it was time for the city to grow beyond the small island it was founded on. The seat of power in Korvosa was transferred to the mainland, and with it went most of the noble families. The exception was House Viamio, who remained on Enron Isle. This was a calculated move by the leadership of the house, Lord Amicus Viamio. As more of the city grew on the mainland, Enron Isle would become known as Old Korvosa. Those who remained felt a sense of abandonment by the nobility, who had left and begun to show their displeasure through protests, which resulted in several deaths and burned down buildings. Encouraged by Amicus Viamio in the shadows, the people of Old Korvosa would eventually take action against Lord Magistrate Rensev, invading his home and killing his entire family. Immediate family, not the entirety of House Ornelos. Following this horrific disaster, Amicus Viamio would put himself forward as a peacemaker, able to bridge the gap between Old and New Korvosa. This tactic worked, and Amicus Viamio would become the new Lord Magistrate of Korvosa in 4491. Lord Magistrate Viamio would spend the next several years encouraging more Chelish people to immigrate to Korvosa, both common and nobles alike. One of these was likely House Galder, who held at least some ties to House Viamio. In a way, this did bring the people of Old and New Korvosa together, in their mutual dislike of the people Viamio was bringing to the city. There was a method to his actions, though, and it came to head in 4502. It began, oddly enough, with a loan to House Viamio from House Jaeger. Amicus would use this money to hire mercenaries from outside the city, including local goblin tribes and disgruntled Shoanti eager to strike any blow they could against the Korvosans. He then demanded all the other noble houses abandon their holdings outside of Endron Isle, claiming they were strategically unsound. This seemed baffling at first, because Korvosa hadn't been at war for over a decade now. So when those houses refused, Lord Magistrate Amicus declared anyone with holdings south of the Isle, across the stretch of water called the Narrows of St. Alika, to be traitors of Cheliax and enemies of Korvosa. He then had those mercenaries he hired attack their holdings, sparking a conflict across the city and kicking off the Cousins' War. The Cousins' War lasted roughly a year, and despite the element of surprise on his side, ended poorly for Amicus Viamio. Captured by the Sable Company when he attempted to flee the city after his defeat, Amicus was taken into the depths of Grand Mastaba beneath Castle Korvosa and never seen again. Ominous when you remember that Sorshan had a whole laboratory down there that no one has yet to explore. The end of the war would also mark the end of House Viamio and their allies House Galder, as all members of both houses were stripped of their titles and their holdings and wealth distributed to the remaining houses in Korvosa. Not the people though, those guys aren't important. Now we've talked a lot about Korvosa's noble houses, and there is still more to say, but I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about Korvosa's more eccentric population. Starting with its serial killers, fun topic, right? Korvosa has quite a few throughout its history, the first being a man named Lassius Braum, all the way back in 4452, where he would claim 3 victims. Braum would kill 5 more people over the next 5 years before being caught and publicly executed for his crimes. How many other killers has the city had like him? We don't entirely know, but based on information we have about at least one later, it seems like their city has a habit of attracting people who enact these patterned murders. But it also attracts those with a desire to do good in the world, which brings us to Blackjack. First appearing during the Cousins' War, Blackjack seems to be a human man in a hooded cloak, using a dagger and rapier to great effect. Fighting for the poor and the downtrodden of the city, no one knows who's behind that mask. Blackjack has appeared sporadically ever since, sometimes going years or even decades between appearances, but always resurfacing. Since these sightings have lasted well beyond the average human lifespan, some wonder if Blackjack is an identity passed on from master to student, or if the human appearance is a disguise for a longer-lived ancestry, or maybe even something supernatural. These 2 individuals, at least to me, showcase an aspect of Korvosa. It's a colony built on the ruins of a literal Sin City. Crime and corruption are common, but so too are people willing to look out for the downtrodden. This theme is repeated quite a few times over Korvosa's continuing history. From fort to city. As we approach the centennial of Fort Korvosa, I think it's appropriate to say we've entered a second chapter of the city's history. So much so that the word fort would be dropped, leaving us with just Korvosa. Most of the previous history has been focused on external conflict between the colonists and the Shoanti tribes. Now, starting with the Cousins' War and moving into the future, the conflicts and issues Korvosa faces are going to be more internal, dealing with ruling class decisions, political intrigues, and natural disasters. Like, for example, the Great Storm of '05, which brought down 3 buildings, 5 docks, and over a dozen ships. Great start to this new era. Now, Korvosa isn't just a city, it's a city-state. A good portion of modern-day Varisia is technically under its control. Palin's Cove and Veldrain date back almost as far as the city itself, but starting in 4511, people would set out from Korvosa into the Varisian wilderness to begin founding towns and claiming discoveries of places the Shoanti had inhabited for decades. The 4 most important of these are Sarwin Hars, founding Hars in 4516, Jaden Balswaif, founding Balswaif in 4563, Jorsh Melfesh, founding Melfesh in 4569, and Jenny Biston, founding Biston in 4574. Each of these towns persists to this day and remains under Korvosa's control, for better or for worse. You'd think they could have at least found a more interesting way to name them. Now, the city itself would make an interesting decision in 4514. Being located partly on an island and entirely on the coast, Korvosa faced a problem with waste disposal. You can't just throw it all into the ocean, then it just washes back up on shore of your city and makes the docks smell somehow even worse. And while they did build a sewer system, the location problem still rears up because there's not many other places for all that waste to go. Well, Lady Magistrate Dress Larong had a solution. Just copy an idea from back home in Cheliax. See, there are these abomination monsters that just revel in filth, dwelling in sewers and eating up waste and slop like a gourmet meal. Just import those and have them eat all our waste. What could possibly go wrong? Aside from the fact that these creatures are almost impossible to control, grow to the size of a horse, can rip a person apart with their powerful tentacles, and, have no reason to stay in the sewers beyond just that you want them to? Yeah, this will end well. Now, to be a little bit fair, it did work for about 23 years. Then, in 4537, the first rampage occurred, where these creatures surged up from the sewers and ran wild in the streets, killing 9 people. In an attempt to stop this from happening, the city installed massive steel plugs with attached winch systems for lowering additional slop into the sewers, to keep the monsters placated and docile. This does work, though once or twice a year a creature will still break out from the plugs when they're opened, at which point the guards need to mobilize in order to subdue them back underground using sedatives and nets. And about every decade or so, the population gets whipped into a frenzy and they break out en masse for another rampage. The filthy, filthy cycle of life. Now, we do have to do a little meta detour here because the creature I just talked about is the Otyugh, an original monster to D&D. After the remaster for Pathfinder removed OGL content, we don't have an exact equivalent replacement for it. They don't come up often in Korvosa's history beyond a few rampages throughout the years, but keep in mind this specific detail might shift in the future if a new creature takes its place. But back to Korvosa's history. In 4541, a massive windstorm hit the city, knocking down several trees and damaging many buildings. In response to this violent arboreal assault, the city passed an ordinance that removed all trees within the city limits. This might seem a little silly, and it is. Moving on. In 4551, Korvosa gained a new great house when Dyson Fordyce managed what many people thought was impossible. After founding the Academy, Volshnek Ornello started a tradition called the Breaching Festival. The premise is simple. One of the Academy's halls was dedicated to protective warding magic, the spells creating a near-impregnable vault. And your goal is to pregnate it. Yes, I've used that joke twice, I will continue to use it in the future. Many tried every year, but none ever made it inside, and every year the festival continued, the grand prize would get even bigger. It had been held for 7 years at this point, which meant there was quite a substantial payout on the line. But that 7th year, Dyson Fordyce managed to just barely squeak his way inside the hall. For this deed, his house, which was essentially a branch of the greater Chelish House Fordyce, was elevated in Korvosa. He used a good bit of his money to finance the rest of his house, and then retired to the town of Veldrain after winning his fame, where he would spend the rest of his life. And that's a good reason to pull our vision outwards again a bit. As we touched on a little while ago, Korvosa is functionally a city-state in control of Varisia's lowlands. Politically, it's still a Chelish colony and swears fealty to the Emperor of Cheliax. However, as is the case with colonial powers time and time again, solving local problems is easier with a local power structure. And as the first and largest city, Korvosa has become the de facto capital. This is important because large-scale problems in the region now become Korvosa's problems. Like, say, the large dragon who sometimes emerges and harasses towns in Varisia's lowlands. Named Gaurataxis, it first appeared in 4569 to terrorize the town of Balswaif for a period of several months before disappearing. It would appear again in 4571 at Palin's Cove, this attack lasting for nearly half a year. The dragon's appearances throughout Korvosa's history would be sporadic and unpredictable. The next major one won't even be for another 100 years, but they do continue occurring. The last major event of the century would happen in 4592, when the Jagir River flooded, damaging several buildings on the city's shoreline. However, no major damage or loss of life was reported, making it possibly the least impactful disaster in Korvosa's lifetime. And soon, things would really be looking up. A time of prophecy was at hand. In 4606, Eridan would return to Cheliax and usher in a new era of prosperity. As a colony, Korvosa would surely benefit from this. Everything was looking up. Of course, that's not what happened. Eridan died, and Cheliax descended into civil war. At this point, we have 2 new noble families introduced to the stage, House Arabesti and House Porphyria. As with most Korvosan houses, they originated in Cheliax and came to Korvosa seeking greater fortune for their houses, and Arabesti didn't really find it. A relative of Abigail Thrun I by marriage, Arbest Arabesti entered Korvosa near the start of the Chelish Civil War, where the chaos in the city pretty much wiped out all his funding. In an effort to rebuild from those losses, he remained in the city and entered into local politics, with the intention of becoming the next Lord Magistrate. Opposing him was Chardas Porphyria, head of House Porphyria. The timeline for their arrival in Korvosa isn't entirely clear. They could have been more established in the city previously, or more recent arrivals compared to, say, Jaeger and Lorong. Regardless, these two houses were eager to take the reins of the city's power. Eventually, Chardas Porphyria secured a deal with House Thrun to attain an official noble title in exchange for defeating Arbest Arabesti for the position of Lord Magistrate. Chardas was eager to secure this for his house, holding rallies around the city to build support for his position. This strategy has just one singular flaw. It has no response to what happens when Chardas just dies randomly at one of these rallies. And thus, House Arabesti assumed power, and House Porphyria was pissed. Notably, there's no evidence of assassination or foul play. Man just fumbled at the finish line in the most permanent way possible. Now, Arbest was an adequate leader, though his tenure in power had several immediate and very pressing problems. Shipments from Cheliax completely ceased as the country barreled towards civil war. The year that should have hosted the city's bicentennial celebration saw the celebration cancelled, and an event even more shocking. Volshenik Ornelos, who had remained alive and in charge of his house since the beginning, was murdered by several powerful devils who suddenly appeared in the city and fought him. The motivation here is unknown, but I doubt it endeared the city's populace much to House Thrun, given their particular associations. And House Thrun's unpopularity would hurt the city further in 4608, when dissatisfaction would spur thousands of Korvosan citizens to leave the city for the independent city of Magnamar off to the west. Now, Arbest Arabesti would die in 4624, and his son Eadred would take his place. Eadred was wildly popular among the people of Korvosa, so much so that it only took a little bit of prodding to get the citizens to reconsider his title from Lord Magistrate to King. Now, this isn't to say that Korvosa declared independence from Cheliax or removed the great houses from government. Rather, in 4644, the city government drafted an alteration to the city's charter specifically spelling out that the King of Korvosa was specifically subservient to the Chelish throne and acting as a steward of the land of Varisia on behalf of Cheliax. The theory here is that granting the city's ruler a more impactful and legitimate title would get greater respect from the powers in Cheliax without actually stepping on House Thrun's highly sensitive and retaliatory toes. To this date, though, House Thrun has never acknowledged the Crimson Throne as anything more than a fancy mayor. But now that we have a Crimson Throne, let's go over the curse of said Crimson Throne. Sounds like a cool title for an adventure, someone ought to write that down. Anywho, according to legend, those who sit on the Crimson Throne are cursed to never pass the throne to a direct descendant or have any children while sitting on the throne, and they are also cursed to die in a non-natural way. The truth of this is a little complicated. For one, Korvosa has only had 5 monarchs in its history, which isn't a great sample size. For another, there is one monarch that kinda managed to dodge the curse, which casts a bit of doubt on the whole thing. But for things like this, the truth of the matter is less important than how true it feels to the common folk, and they have a pretty solid feeling on this. Now, if we're talking superstitions, I think it's more telling that the year Eadred was officially declared king, the population of deadly sea monsters called reef claws that live on Varisia's coast exploded, leading to something called Blood Summer. That's an ominous start to a monarchy in my opinion, but I'm not Korvosan, so I guess I don't really count. But there isn't much more recorded about Eadred's reign, so he seems to have corrected things pretty well. This period also saw the first new great house added to Korvosa's government, where House Zenderholm displaced House Fordyce, who never had much luck beyond that whole Breaching Festival win. Things would take a turn with Eadred's heir. Having no direct descendants available, when Eadred died in 4657, his nephew Cardwraith Arabasti took the throne. The textbook definition of a spoiled nepo baby, Cardwraith immediately began issuing bizarre proclamations and enacting seemingly random punishments against, well, random people. His actions were so erratic and concerning that the village of Biston actually attempted to rebel against Korvosa. But a foolish king still has an army, and Biston did not. Martial law was declared in the village, and harsh punishments for sedition and rebellion were given out swiftly to remind all those little people who was really in charge. Thankfully, Korvosa was spared Cardwraith's long and disastrous rule by him dying randomly in 4661. Instead, they were subject to a different disastrous ruler. Not Cardwraith's son. Now, thankfully, the curse hit him too. He didn't have any of those. In fact, it seemed like Arabestes were gone from the city entirely at this point. Instead, good old House Porphyria decided to swoop in and grab the place they'd wanted this entire time. Chardas III, grandson to that guy who died way back then, was able to fulfill his house's desire for control over the colony, assuming the Crimson Throne. And once again, as I said with Eadred, the real curse of the Crimson Throne is horrible monster attacks happening right when they get a new king. Remember that dragon Galrataxis that would rampage off and on? Well, he's back, and he's rampaging. Oh, that Galrataxis, such a silly little guy with his, murder sprees. Anywho, King Chardas decided it was time to do something about that, and enlisted several adventuring companies to seek out and kill this horrible dragon. They did not succeed. I guess King Chardas felt like the people needed a good morale boost, and nothing boosts morale like a quick, easy, and profitable war. And you know who looks like a nice, easy target? Those weirdos over in Kermaga. We'll just walk on over, smash them up a bit, get some free loot, be living large, and 117 people have died in this disaster of a siege. That's not good. King Chardas and House Porphyria were only able to hold on to power for 6 years. Back in Cheliax, Domina Arabasti learned of her family's royal lineage and decided, you know what, being a queen sounds fun, I'm gonna go do that. She arrived in the harbor with a small fleet of Chelish frigates in 4667 and began her reign the same year. We don't 100% know how King Chardas died that year, but it was definitely abrupt. Let's just leave it at that. Domina Arabasti would immediately get to work improving the city. She repealed that order against trees within the walls and ordered several fast-growing species planted. She brought numerous new trade connections from Cheliax into the city and leveraged them quite effectively. The influx of money was funneled back into the city through a variety of public works projects that we'll go over when we discuss the city's layout. Of course, many of these public improvements were in line with the kind of ideals promoted by House Thrune back in Cheliax, so you might have different opinions on how effective building a Hell Knight citadel or temple to Asmodeus would be to the public. Now, Queen Domina's reign wasn't without disasters, like the most recent sighting of Gower Taxis in 4674, or a moderate earthquake in 4680 that damaged many walls and buildings, but Korvosa saw itself through these years and forward into the future. Many now look back on Domina as the city's best monarch. She even managed to kind of beat the curse of the Crimson Throne, being succeeded by her direct heir and son, Archipolus Arabasti, following her death in 4686. Or, maybe she didn't beat it, because the curse is said to keep the ruler from conceiving an heir while they sit on the throne. And Domina's son was already born when she took it, and she never did have another child after she did. Plus, we don't fully know how she died. Well, I'm gonna stick to my assertion that the throne is just too scared to curse her. I'm sure Korvosans will line up to tell me how wrong I am. Just remember, the complaint box is 5 silvers per complaint. So you might wonder, how do we get from Archipolus to Eadred II? The answer is simple. The man just changed his name. He did so in order to invoke his popular ancestor's memory, hoping to gain more support from the common people. It also makes talking about him much easier for me, because Archipolus is a bit of a mouthful, but I don't think he had me in mind when he made that change. As the current king of Korvosa, Eadred II has done an adequate job of governing. He has a much lighter touch than his mother, and is seemingly a little bit more compassionate. For example, she continued the martial law lockdown in Biston, while he ended it in 4690. A shrewd politician, he kept the city's wealthy and nobles mostly content, even as he plays them against each other to secure his own power. He continued his mother's policy of public works, though was a little more willing to dip into the city's funds to satisfy his own desires. Specifically his desire for young women, the kind who are just on the edge of propriety. Unmarried for quite a long time, his personal life was full of scandals that always seemed to verge on being damning, but never quite tipping over. This would shift, though not necessarily change, in 4704 when a young noblewoman from West Crown named Iliosa Arvansi came to Korvosa. She scandalized her family by coming to such a backwater, but she did so with purpose. She knew quite well King Eadred's taste in women and had grand ambitions of her own. Ambitions that bore fruit after a shockingly short courtship, transforming her into Queen Iliosa Arabasti of Korvosa. She and King Eadred have had an interesting relationship so far. There's not a lot of love there, though clearly a good amount of, let's call it, passion, though the motivation behind said passion is different for both. Eadred is attracted to Iliosa's form, while she is attracted to his power and prestige. And while Eadred generally cares for the city, Iliosa seems to view it as a bank that won't stop whining. People's opinions of Iliosa are mixed. Some loyalists are dedicated to the crown enough to follow her regardless of what they think, and those who please the queen do find themselves well rewarded. But she clearly looked down on both the common people of Korvosa and the city itself as nothing more than a rural backwater of no great importance. In return, the people of Korvosa see her as a seductive pretender from Cheliax, bleeding their king and the city dry to suit her own whims. The nobility, meanwhile, seem to view her with a mix of distaste and respect. They acknowledge that she had the drive to grab the throne, but resent her for doing it. Very game recognized game. And so we finally, at long last, arrive in the modern day. Just last year, in 4707, Korvosa celebrated its tricentennial, 300 years since the city's bloody colonial founding as Fort Korvosa. Now it's the largest city in Varisia, home to families that have lived here for generations. King Eadred still doesn't have an heir, and Queen Iliosa shows no sign of giving one anytime soon. To make matters worse, the king's health has recently taken a turn. Queen Domina escaped the curse of the Crimson Throne, but it seems like her son might not be so lucky. A thorough look at modern Korvosa. Alright Pathfinders, we've looked at how Korvosa came to be. Now it's time to look at this city as it is right now. Korvosa can be divided into 6 specific districts, with a few of those districts having their own subdivided wards. And since we've already been talking about the city's ancient history, I think it's appropriate to start with the original city located on Endron Isle. Old Korvosa. Old Korvosa is separated from the mainland by the Narrows of St. Alika, named for Alika Epikena. While it initially looks like over 24 bridges cross the relatively narrow gap, those are actually docks jutting into the water. Only one bridge connects the island to the mainland. The eastern portion of the island is largely flat and made up of the Old Dock District. As you move west, the island climbs in height up Garrison Hill, where the ancient walls of Old Fort Korvosa can still be seen, from back when this was all the land the city held. Opposite side of the hill, bordering the ocean, is Bridgefront. Old Korvosa is a poor, run-down, and crumbling district. Almost discarded by the rest of the city, left to rot in the riverbed just far enough away from the real city that it doesn't have to care about it. The only exception to this is the privileged few that live on Garrison Hill. The most prominent are the Arcona family, who reside in Palace Arcona, a massive home made of black marble and bearing decorations more fitting of a Voudran home. As one of the 5 great houses currently ruling the city alongside the monarchy, the Arcona possess a great deal of influence within Korvosa as a whole, but here in the old part of town, the king's name may as well be Arcona, not Arabasti. Now there are a few respectable institutions within this part of the city, such as the Endron Military Academy, which acts as a barracks for Korvosa's guard and Sable Company trainees stationed in the area. Nearby is the Orsini Academy, run by notable local Vincarlo Orsini, a master swordsman who trains young men and women, mostly nobles from various houses, in the fine art of person peeling. Meanwhile, if history is more your thing, the old city hall can be found here as well. This place has a ghost of a staff at this point, being replaced entirely by newer and more well-kept buildings in the rest of the city. However, it is still historically very important. Doing business in Old Korvosa generally means one of 2 things. Either you're selling fish, or you're selling something else while on the lookout for marks. That's not to say that everyone in Old Korvosa is a career-hardened criminal. What they are is poor, desperate, and packed together. Almost 1/10 of the city's population is crammed into Bridgefront, and 8 out of every 10 of those are barely scraping by. Part of the reason for this actually has to do with Korvosa's business practices and legal code. Per the city's charter, Korvosa does not allow mercantile unions or guilds to operate within the city. The exception to this, ironically, is the local thieves guild, the Cerulean Society. They function as basically a legalized protection racket. Members will wear official blue uniforms and come around to collect their fees from noble houses, merchants, banks, and anyone wealthy enough to afford not getting stolen from. And if they don't pay, the guild keeps a list of people who are looking to make some extra cash and don't mind liberating it from the more fortunate around. Of course, stealing itself is still against the law, so the guild is very careful with regulating its contractors to keep them out of jail and in the business. Now, to add to the layers of this irony, the society doesn't operate in Old Korvosa, likely too few targets and too many local gangs. Instead, they regulate those gangs and twice a year send someone through to collect, let's call them taxes, from the local street thieves operating on the island. In terms of legitimate business, Old Korvosa is home to Reefclaw Run Market, a seafood market dating back 3 centuries to the city's founding. The workers here don't just sell fish, though it's mostly fish. But Varisia is home to numerous sunken ruins, and you never know what someone's gonna fish up when they trawl the depths long enough. Off to the east, you have Copperbeater Hall, where copper ore is shipped in and then, you will never guess this, beaten into various shapes before being sold to construction or to more refined craftsmen. On roughly the opposite side of town, the ironworks processes pig iron and recycled scraps into wrought iron goods. It's more of a factory that emphasizes quantity over quality, so Korvosa's blacksmiths can stay in business producing custom, higher quality works. Almost directly between both locations is probably the most curious producer in the city. Hessem Nubian Sage Paint Manufactory produces a wide variety of high-quality paints. From cheap to extremely expensive, they support a small community of artists that live and work in Old Korvosa, producing beautiful art in spite of the horrible conditions. This place has been around for over 108 years and seems to still be run by the same 3 old men. That's a hell of a feat, and I'd be very careful when you go there to buy some phthalo green and yellow ochre. Now, any city is going to have a myriad of pubs, and any city with dock workers is going to have some particularly interesting ones. The Sticky Mermaid is the place to go if you want to get into a brawl or 3 before the night is over, unless the guard has gotten annoyed enough with the place to shut it down. That happens every few months or so, with the owner making some donations to the local Abadar church to get relicensed. Also, I don't know how or why the mermaid is sticky, and I do not want to know. If places with history and character are more your thing, Jagear's Jug is probably a better fit. The building actually survived the Great Fire that burned most of Old Fort Korvosa, and it's rumored that Montlarian Jagear drank here often, including 1 week before he died. That specific rumor is unverified, but he did stop in often for a shot of Chilexian pepper whiskey and a round on him. After his death, Juggy's Jug was renamed in his honor. And our last tavern is the Traveling Man, famed for the old adage of location, location, location. See, the tavern is located near one of those plugs the city uses to feed its sewer monsters, and every week there's a chance for one to break free and cause havoc. Patrons flock to the traveling man and its exceptionally sturdy front walls and windows in order to reserve a seat for the action. Now, if virtue is more your thing, you're in the wrong part of town. But you might find an old faded bit of it here at one of the last technically still functioning temples of Eridan. When the god died, most of his faithful were absorbed into Diomede's church, and those that didn't have slowly faded and died off as 100 years have passed. Once a proud part of the city, this temple is maintained as best it can be by a trio of old clerics still holding services for their almost entirely gone congregation. The city has actually threatened them with eviction several times to replace the temple, but so far they've held on, which is a blessing considering what happened to the other temple of Eridan in Old Korvosa. Shifting from virtue to vice, we have exemplary execrables. Formerly another temple of Eridan, this place is now... there's no polite way to say it, it's a snuff museum and playhouse. The owner, Pilz Swastel, delights in showing gruesome plays depicting death, pain, and many things that would cause the Hell Knights to barge in and swing before asking questions. Strangely popular are death plays, where a member of the audience is taken on stage and murdered in front of a cheering crowd. Reportedly, the special effects are pretty great, though perhaps a bit too realistic, especially since some people who go on stage aren't seen the next day. The attached museum is more of the same, as well as exhibits showing all the horrible ways people have hurt each other. The current newest display is a guillotine from Gault. If the sign by it is to be believed, it's taken 37 overly curious fingers, though I'm not sure I'd trust that number. Only come if you have a strong stomach for the grossest of things. Now, more traditional vices can be found at Eel's End, a group of 5 ships permanently anchored at the end of the Narrows. Well, anchored is perhaps a clean word, more like haphazardly piled. The biggest ship is the Eel's End, which gives the place its name, and is the home and office of Devargo Barvasi, known as the King of Spiders. Named that for his affinity for the creatures, Devargo rents out the other 4 ships for various businesses of questionable legality, though he runs a tight enough ship that the guard haven't been able to bust him for anything. Each of the other vessels has a specialty of sort. The Twin Tigers is a gambling hall, the Dragon's Breath is a drug den, the House of Clouds is a brothel, and the Golden Hawk is a flop house for the sex, drug, and rock rolled to sleep it off before they can come back tomorrow night to do it all again. Old Korvosa feels like a city within a city. It's isolated and has its own kind of character, unique to the people that call it home. The more respectable elements of the city would rather avoid talking about it, or thinking about it, or mentioning it in any way. Those who live within it either struggle to survive or else lord their position at the top over everyone below them. Gangs scuffle for street turf, or in the case of the Rat Street Boys, sewer space for the gang of were-rats. While small-time bosses like the King of Spiders scoop what they can from House Arcona and the rest of the big players. It's kind of a horrible place to live sometimes, but for the poor and downtrodden, it's home. North Point. Heading south into the city proper on the mainland, we have North Point. The first location on the mainland settled by the Chelish, North Point today is home to many of Korvosa's oldest non-noble families. Much of the city government is headquartered here as well, centered around City Hall and the Longacre Building. City Hall slightly diminished after the establishment of the monarchy shifted power towards Castle Korvosa, but much of the day-to-day government activity still takes place here. Prior to Eadred I taking the throne, the magistrates of City Hall functionally controlled the entire city. After he took the throne, Eadred delegated various aspects of running the city that he didn't want to deal with to these magistrates. Though Queen Domina eliminated many magistrate positions, following her death most have been restored. There are at least 23 magistrates in the city, though many of them are kind of obscure, and there are only 3 that people really know about. Garrick Tan is the Magistrate of Commerce, and he's functionally the taxman. So everyone hates him. In addition, he also regulates the city's fees and acts as a union buster in the city. So he's even worse than he was 1 sentence ago. Oh, how I hate him. In contrast, Sly Gar is the Magistrate of Expenditures and is the most loved government official because his job is to spend all the tax money. So if he shows up in an area, the bulging city purse is likely to follow. Finally, Lolia Perrone is the Magistrate of Regulation and is responsible for maintaining the system of weights, measures, and scales the city relies on for commerce to function. Like many of her predecessors, she is a cleric of Abadar, as this position's association with banking means that it's traditionally held by a cleric of that deity. Meanwhile, the Longacre Building, officially known as Arbiter's Hall, is the last stop for any criminal the city manages to catch. The Arbiters are a combination of judges and legal scholars. Their main job is to judge criminal and civil cases brought before the city courts. Any civil and most criminal cases only need a single arbiter, though more complicated or high-profile ones can have up to 9 arbiters presiding. They always use an odd number to avoid any possible tie. The arbiters also act as a check on the monarch's power. While the king can make any kind of decree he wants, and many will treat those decrees as law by default, before they actually become a law, a group of 7 arbiters must examine said decree to make sure there aren't any contradictions between the king's decree, Chelish law, and the Korvosan charter, and its many amendments. Only if 5 arbiters agree does the decree actually become law. Should the law be rejected, one of the arbiters who voted against it must advise the king on exactly what legal issues caused this rejection and how to possibly alter the law so that it could legally go forward. The arbiters have a reputation for harsh judgment, which is only kind of true. For starters, though the verdicts can't be appealed, any punishment enacted by the arbiter can be appealed by the King of Korvosa, though very few people actually know about this. Secondly, only extremely violent crimes, or crimes against Korvosa itself, are punishable with death. Beneath the Longacre building is Death Head Vault, where prisoners are kept and any executions take place in the form of hanging or beheading. Rumors persist that prisoners will sometimes disappear from down here, though that's mostly not true. The weirdest part is the disappeared prisoners who sometimes reappear years later, with little memory or willingness to talk about what happened while they were gone. Now, while it's not technically a government building, the Bank of Abadar might as well be one. After all, money makes the world go round, and no one handles money better than the priests working for the god of cities, banking, and civilization. Cough, capitalism, cough. Beneath the bank are the vaults, some of the most secure places in the city, as well as the mint responsible for Korvosa's coin. Led by archbanker Darb Tuttle, the bank takes care of all the city's finance needs, at a reasonable price. For a bit of contrast, this area also houses the Sanctuary of Shellen. The smallest independent temple in the city, the sanctuary is filled with a variety of local artwork and flowering plants, the perfect place for any artist from Old Korvosa to gain some inspiration. Now that's not to say that everything in North Point is on the up and up. The dock trade is one of Korvosa's smaller open-air markets, and the reason for that is constant scrutiny. The Hell Knights and the Guard both know that stolen goods flow through this market, but can't seem to get the proper proof to make any kind of bust or arrest. There's enough legitimate business that the market stays busy, even as the guards watch out for that under-the-table stuff. The real claim to fame is a family of pseudo-dragons that nest in the nearby buildings. They keep the local vermin population under control, but have a habit of swooping in to grab anything in the market that catches their attention, by smelling tasty or looking shiny. No one would go so far as to kill the creatures, but irate merchants will occasionally drive them away, which seems like a great idea until the rats start moving in. Then said merchants need to track the creatures down and make amends so they can get back to business as usual. The rest of the notable locations here are inns and taverns, which are a little more upscale than what you'd find in Old Korvosa. The oldest one is the Laughing Waves, one of the only buildings here from the first attempt to take main shore during the conflict with the Shoanti. Aptly named after a nickname for Kira Palin, the Laughing Waves has a long and storied history, made all the more mysterious by the ghost of a Shoanti woman who appears 3 times a year, once on each solstice and once at the start of the summer for a local festival called the Riverwind Festival. Barbarian princess who appears at the start of a Riverwind Festival. I could be reaching, but I wonder if that's a subtle Dragonlance reference. Anyway, the next oldest inn is the Whitecaps, and it definitely looks the part. Not rundown per se, just old. The kind of place with history and character. Still, while it won't slap you in the face with luxury, it also won't slap you with a high bill. The place also has an impeccable reputation for safety and security, with only 7 reported burglaries in its 200-plus year history. Ignore the fact that 2 of those are pretty recent, it's being worked on. Now, if you want someplace quiet and low-key to drink, the Three Rings Tavern has you covered. Run by a retired adventurer and pathfinder named Theodora Darklight, yes, she did change her last name to sound cooler, and no, I'm not telling you what it used to be, the Three Rings Tavern is generally a nice place to settle down for a cozy drink. In fact, they sell almost as much coffee and tea as they do alcohol. It's also got a great breakfast spread for regulars that know about it. Now, our final tavern is quite a place, but to get there you have to walk by the Avenue of Arms, a downright weird landmark in the city. Along the road, paced every 2 feet and 3.5 inches, are 127 stone arms. They all appear to belong to adult humans, about a quarter of them feminine while the rest seem masculine, all in a variety of poses. About 1/3 of them have rusted weapons, while the other third hold what look like stone carvings of weapons. None of them appear weathered or aged, despite predating the colonists' arrival here, and are all facing the same direction, elbow bending away from the shore to point toward the road. No one knows how they got there or why. Now, if you can pass Creepy Statue Arm Lane, you'll arrive at the Posh and Turtle, one of the most unique taverns in the city. One of the nicest places you can stay, the Posh and Turtle is owned by a former adventuring wizard named Thalvian Regulus. The most immediately notable thing about the tavern is the glass floor, which overlooks a wide, shallow sea cave. Inside the cave lives Old Tom, a sea turtle who has grown too large to get back out of the cave into the sea. Now he serves as a mascot for the tavern, the Turtle of Posh and Turtle. The floor has small grates that allow customers to drop food in for Old Tom, and Thalvian uses magic to clean the cave and Tom regularly, to keep the smell down. Honestly, I'd drop a good amount of coin just to be able to feed a nice old turtle while I ate dinner. Interestingly, the name of the tavern doesn't come from the posh food and decor. It's also a bit of old city slang. See, the place wasn't always a tavern, it used to be a drug den specializing in pesh. And so the locals would ask for the pesh in the turtle. And the slurring voices being what they are, pesh became posh and we're off to the races. Thalvian embraced the name when he bought the place, hoping to pivot to the current upscale reputation, and it worked beyond his wildest dreams. North Point serves as an interesting contrast to Old Korvosa, showing the kind of better, more upscale lifestyle that can be found just across the strait if you're somebody who happens to know the right people or be in the right circles. Much of the remaining city is a little bit more like North Point than Old Korvosa, which you can take in a couple of different ways, I think. The Heights. Now since we're over on this side of the city anyway, let's shift over just a bit and start talking about the Heights. Located on Citadel Hill, the Heights look down on the rest of the city, creating a nice visual metaphor for the nobility that lives there. The Heights can be further divided into 3 different wards. Citadel Crest is the richest of the districts, the upperest of the crust. It's so gentrified you won't even find an inn in this part of the city, but several bespoke bed and breakfast establishments. Farther south is Cliffside, running along the coastal edge of Korvosa to the wall that once marked the edge of the city. If you head east from Citadel Crest instead, you'll enter the University Ward, home to the Academy, the University of Korvosa, and other smaller institutions of learning. And of course, ruling over them all at the center is Castle Korvosa. So let's begin there. Castle Korvosa sits on top of the old Shoanti pyramid Grand Mastaba. Most of the pyramid remains intact, but the southern edge has crumbled slightly, collapsing from years of stonemasons and construction workers just kind of taking from the pyramid for other buildings in the city. Eadred I made this practice illegal, which is good because having the foundations of your castle looted out from under you is a bad look. Oh, and also that pyramid is full of Thessalian horrors buried in the lowest unexplored levels, so, probably good we didn't let those out. Now, Grand Mastaba was constructed with a flat top inherently, so all the Korvosans had to do to prepare it for the castle construction was tear down the Shoanti's wooden palisades and defenses. The main wall was completed in 4464, and since then various Lord Magistrates, Kings, and Queens have added their own additions to the castle. While an attempt has been made to keep a consistent Neo-Chalaxian architecture style, think all black and covered in enough gargoyles to make David Xanatos giddy, the additions create a very mismatched look to the whole place. It's not helped by the fact that they can't really build outwards, so most additions are just another tower grafted onto the main building. Castle Korvosa is only allowed a few permanent residents. The king or queen and their immediate family are allowed to reside there, as is the castle seneschal and their immediate family. Both are permitted to invite long-term guests to stay in the castle, such as the king's various, young female attendants, but any guest can be evicted by either party at any time, except during a war. In fact, prior to the establishment of the monarchy, Castle Korvosa was a much more administrative building. It was the main garrison for the city's military force and eventually the headquarters of the Sable Company. In fact, the Sable Company Commandant, that's their leader by the way, maintains a close connection to the Seneschal of Castle Korvosa. Per an amendment to the city's charter, the Seneschal is the official liaison between the city government and the independent Sable Company. Among other things, this gives the Seneschal veto power over appointment of any Sable Company Commandant. This is actually kind of important because when the Seneschal dies or retires, the replacement is appointed by the Korvosan Guard from a member of the Sable Company, typically the current Commandant. Clean little cycle there. The current Seneschal, Neolandus Kalapopoulos, has served in the position for 47 years and is expected to retire on the 50th anniversary of his appointment. He's currently quite close to the current Sable Company Commandant Marcus Endron, and many think he's preparing the young man to take his place. Most Korvosans consider the Seneschal of the castle to be the second most powerful position in the city, given the broad leeway they have to direct politicians and policy. In fact, prior to Queen Domina, they were even powerful enough to evict the royal family from Castle Korvosa if they so wished, functionally booting them from power. Domina's popularity among the people allowed her to pass one of the last amendments to the city's charter, granting permanent residence to any monarch bearing Arabasti name to Castle Korvosa. Only via a unanimous vote among the 5 great houses, the Seneschal, and a randomly chosen arbiter can an Arabasti monarch be removed. Though the Seneschal can do the opposite, locking a monarch within the palace at any time. Say what you will about pivoting to monarchy, it does result in some weird laws and regulations when you do it second instead of pivoting away from it. In fact, Eadred II's greatest strength as a ruler is his ability to juggle and work within the various levers of power within Korvosa. The city's military power is split between the Korvosan Guard, the Sable Company, and to a lesser extent the Order of the Nail Hell Knights who have a citadel outside of Korvosa. Meanwhile, political power is split between the arbiters, the magistrates, and the great houses. Juggling all that while still having time to creep on girls a third of his age isn't easy, that's all I'm saying. Korvosa's small number of previous monarchs had very extreme reputations in public perception. Eadred II, by contrast, is mostly seen as fine. Not universally beloved like his mom or the guy whose name he took, but not hated like the other two whose names I don't feel like looking up for spelling a second time. Moving on from the king, we have the great houses of Korvosa. Most of Korvosa's houses have their roots in Cheliax. Even the ones who officially got their start here, like House Endron and Bromathan, were just Chelish colonizers whose actions boosted their social standing. But despite their good reputation and history, none of those houses number among Korvosa's 5 great houses. Those houses are House Arcona, Jaeger, Lorong, Ornelos, and Zenderholm. Jaeger, Lorong, and Zenderholm all have family and holdings back in Cheliax, while House Arcona and Ornelos primarily reside in Korvosa. Arcona deals in Voudran imports and has their own little fiefdom up in Old Korvosa that we just discussed. Ornelos and Lorong both deal in education, Ornelos the magical side at the Academy, Lorong the mundane education at the University of Korvosa. House Jaeger deals in finance and trade, owning most of the docks and almost 25% of the city's private assets. They act as financial backers to the crown, several noble houses, the Korvosan Guard, and the Sable Company, being very important to enough people that no one wants to risk their ire. Lastly, House Zenderholm is the newest one and is highly political, its members being arbiters, magistrates, and lawyers. Since I brought it up, let's shift our focus to the Academy, Korvosa's one and only school for learning magic. Asterisk, it is not the only school for learning magic, though it really wants to think it is. The school is built almost like a town within a town, large black marble walls concealing all but the tallest buildings within. Almost anything a student needs is provided by the school, so those studying inside the Academy rarely need to leave. All forms of magic are taught here, but some are given a little more prominence than others. The largest building is the Hall of Summoning, a somewhat new addition. This specific building, they always had a Hall of Summoning, but this one is 5 times larger than the previous one and only finished construction about 25 years ago. Though House Thrun has no official say in what the Academy teaches, the number of students capable of conjuring devils has increased dramatically since the end of the Chelish Civil War. This also contributes to the pest problem Korvosa finds itself stuck with. See, the easiest infernal creature to conjure is an imp, so many of the casters in the hall will call them up as practice or the first step on their journey to mastering greater arts of summoning. And these imps don't always get banished. Some will simply be let loose, while others become familiars for wizards who then flunk out, die, or just get tired of the creatures. However it happens, the high rooftops of the Academy are filled with flying infernal assholes eager to make things hard for people around the city. They've actually formed something of a rivalry with a subspecies of pseudo-dragon that lives in Korvosa called house drakes. It's not uncommon to see swarms of both creatures dueling each other in the skies for territory control. The rest of the Academy's buildings are more reasonable in size and scope. Ornello's Hall was, up until the new building's completion, the Hall of Summoning during its construction. It now serves as the Academy's administrative building. The Hall of Seeing focuses on divinatory-type spells, with the entry door looking like a stylized hero card. Which card exactly changes depending on who touches it, and you can bet there are ones people consider pretty bad luck to see when they make their way inside. The Hall of Induction looks like a giant metal cube and has 5 levels filled with nothing. No chalkboards, chairs, or classrooms, which seems weird until you realize it's where the battle magic is practiced. When evoking fireballs and lightning bolts, it's best to keep the damageable clutter down to a minimum. The Hall of Lies teaches illusion magic, and its appearance shifts every day at dawn, seemingly at random. The Hall of Shaping, meanwhile, focuses on transmutation and looks like something out of an abstract painting's fever dream. This is because the final test for graduates is to alter the building in some way. If it collapses or they don't manage it, they failed. And failing this means they get transformed into a bird and is forced to now live the rest of their life in a cage on the hall's top floor. Which, if I wasn't confident in my finals grade, I think I'd probably just drop out first. But I think that means they just send you to the Hall of Induction with a target on your back? Anyway, the Hall of Charms teaches the subtle art of enchanting others to your will and is probably the prettiest building on campus. Right next to it is the creepiest, the Hall of Whispers, which teaches the necromantic arts. Place is super haunted, by the way. But none of these are as famous as the Hall of Wards, focused on protective magic. This is the site of the annual Breaching Festival. Every year, the top students of each school, as well as Thieves Guild leadership and 4 randomly selected street gangs, are given an invitation to compete. The less-than-legal attendants are granted amnesty for their past crimes in exchange for attendance, to incentivize them to participate and try their hardest. The goal of the festival is to breach the Hall of Wards. From sunrise to sunset, anyone that can step foot inside the building will win the grand prize. Every year that no one wins, the prize money is increased. Since the festival was first held in 4544, only Dice and Fordice has ever successfully done this. The pot is rumored to be incredibly large at this point, exceeding a noble house's entire yearly budget and supplemented with fantastic magic items produced by the Academy. But given the number of students that go missing trying to breach the hall each time the festival is held, the payout might not be worth the risk. Now, Volshynek Ornello served as the head of the Academy until his death in 4607, when a contingent of devils appeared and killed him within the halls of the Academy. His distant nephew Toph Ornelos has taken his place as the headmaster of the Academy and runs things much like his great-uncle once did. Which is what they'd have you all believe. The truth of the matter is that Volshynek Ornelos both never died, and died centuries ago. The true Volshynek lived through the prime of his life and in his twilight years was desperate to avoid the ravages of age. However, nothing worked to slow his aging. In desperation, he sought out House Thrun, who even at that time had a reputation for dealing with devils. The lady of the house at the time refused him, but his pleas eventually reached the ears of another, who offered him an infernal deal. The devil Lorthak had been banished from Hell for crossing the powerful Queen of Night Iseth, Hell's Valkyrie. Hiding out on Galarian, Lorthak offered Volshynek a deal. He would give Volshynek his youth, the man would not age another day. In exchange, Lorthak would gain control of his soul, and House Ornelos should Volshynek ever die. The Lord Ornelos agreed, and found the devil true to his word. He did not age from that moment forward. But some of you might have noticed a key detail, a little something that may have slipped Lord Volshynek's attention. Lorthak never said he was immortal, just that he wouldn't be aging. The body might not change, but that clock is still ticking. In 4493, looking as young as he had when he made the deal, Lord Volshynek Ornelos died of old age, and the devil Lorthak assumed his identity. Now you might assume the devil attack was Lorthak faking his death to quash some rumors or another about Volshynek Ornelos and the source of his immortality, but no, that attack was real. Lorthak had already cultivated a rumor about immortality. He had no reason to slide his identity into the shadows. Except, remember the year that happened, 4607, 1 year after Aroden died, as Cheliax and Hell were growing more closely aligned. And no one with power in the pit forgets a slight or a grudge. Iseth had found Lorthak, and she was hell-bent on his death. So the attack was real, but Lorthak's death wasn't. See, now he had a good reason to retire his identity to get the heat off his back, so he faked Volshynek Ornelos' death, then returned home to tell his family that he was going to survive in the shadows for now. So while Toph Ornelos is nominally in charge of the Academy and the family, in reality, Lorthak still pulls the strings. And isn't that something? An entire noble house of Korvosa placed under the rule of a vile fiend who killed their leader and took their place, ruling from a human guise for years while corrupting numerous family members and city institutions for their own ends. Can you imagine how crazy that would be if that actually happened twice and not just once? Not a lot of nickels, weird it happened twice, yada yada yada. This is called foreshadowing and will help us in a later video. But out from Academy plots and secret devil uncles and back into the streets of Korvosa. Our first stop is actually a little shop south of the Academy called the Gilded Orrery. Run by a woman named Gasta Wigra, niece of Toph Ornelos, the shop caters exclusively to students of the Academy. Well, and anyone associated with the Ornelos family, or any wizard sufficiently impressive enough with cash to spare. But not anyone associated with the monarchy. She categorically refuses to sell them anything. The shop works with the Academy to make sure it always has the textbooks students need in stock. They'll even buy those books back at the end of a student's time at the school, for a fraction of the price. Even in fantasy, college textbooks are a ripoff. But if you prefer a more mundane education, the University of Korvosa has you covered. Consisting of 5 major buildings along with a few satellite offices throughout the city, the University of Korvosa doesn't have the magical prestige of the Academy, but studying there still holds a lot of weight. Houses Larong and Jaguar are still heavily involved in the funding of the university, and it's in many ways the legacy of both houses. The oldest building at the university is literally Larong Hall, and is flanked by statues of Jissa Larong and Tarathan Jaguar, just to drive the point home. And I think that's as good a transition as any to talk about the Jaguar Museum. Cultivated by Mercival Jaguar, the museum holds hundreds, possibly even thousands, of artifacts collected by the Jaguar family in their various explorations and adventures. Most of the collection is from around Varisia, as much of the family followed in Montlarian Jaguar's footsteps. However, treasures from Osirian, Tian Sha, and even Arcadia sit in these halls. There's even an entire wing devoted to natural history, documenting flora and fauna from across Golarion. Mercival is even willing to purchase objects from freelancers if they meet the museum's standards. This part of the city isn't just home to education facilities, it also houses the headquarters of the Sable Company, in a building whose construction rivals the gigantic Thessalonian monuments of old. And that's without a cadre of giant slaves to boot. The Great Tower stands 270 feet tall, though when Queen Domina commissioned it, they planned for the structure to be even taller. Drafted by an architect from distant Alkenstar, the 320-foot structure had an extensive internal metal skeleton for supporting its weight. Building the tower sucked up almost all of the city's funds and likely would have bankrupted the monarchy if they'd actually finished the last 50 feet. With Queen Domina's death, her son decided that 270 feet was tall enough and declared the building complete. It currently has 19 levels, including several vaults in the lower levels holding the arms and armor of the Sable Company. Despite its size, the tower only has 2 entrances. The main one on level 3 is what 99% of people use since it's actually accessible on foot via bridge. The other entrance is shared across the top 3 floors, accessible by the hippogriffs that the Sable Company rides. Most of the company sleeps here as well, with the upper levels acting as an eyrie for their mounts. The lower levels function as a training facility and academy for the Endron Military Academy, which means we never left the university section at all. I tricked you. Actually, no, I didn't. That's just a funny coincidence. Anyway, let's talk about Queen Domina's other construction project. The Temple of Asmodeus wasn't originally built by her, rather it was hastily built in 4608 to appease the new Chelish leadership. The hasty construction job proved to not be the best idea, as every year the temple needed to undergo extensive renovation and maintenance, none of which seemed to work well enough to prevent the need to do it again next year. Resembling a large 5-pointed star, at one point 2 of the temple's wings collapsed in the same year, killing at least 1 cleric and maiming several laborers. The Church of Asmodeus was, needless to say, more affronted than impressed. Queen Domina ordered the entire temple rebuilt in 4683, rededicating the building with an infernal ritual that involved the ritual sacrifice of 13 virgins. The common people of Korvosa were not happy about that. I wouldn't be either. Already concerned about Cheliax and House Thrun's relationship with Hell, seeing a full-on blood sacrifice to the pit was a little too harsh. Queen Domina, though, had a solution. At her own personal expense, she brought in powerful clerics to return as many of the sacrifices to life as possible. 4 of them refused the resurrection for whatever reason, but the other 9 are actually still alive now. This did a lot to soothe the people and actually makes a very apt metaphor for Queen Domina's rule and popularity. Harsh and dangerous, but if you sacrifice for me, I'll sacrifice for you in turn. Though I do wonder how effective a sacrifice is if you do a take-backsy on it. Either way, the current Church of Asmodeus maintains a lot of the city's connection to the Chelish homeland and often competes with the much more popular Church of Abadar as officiator for various city contracts. persistent rumors connect it to the slave trade, though no evidence has been found despite searches from the Korvosan Guard, the Sable Company, and the Order of the Nail. Much less controversial is the Temple of Sarenrae. Unlike most of Korvosa's buildings, which are made of black marble, the temple here is made of white marble imported from elsewhere. This actually makes it one of the most expensive buildings in the city, though many consider the price worth it. As the goddess of healing, Sarenrae is extremely popular and well-loved, which is good because a city like Korvosa, something like disease could really rip through the population without proper triage. Now, as we talked about earlier, there are no proper inns in Citadel Crest, by specific city ordinance. Instead, expensive bed and breakfasts offer a room and food for quite high prices. The cheapest, relatively, is the Frisky Unicorn. Its claim to fame is a large attached turret, from which you can see almost all of Korvosa spread out below you. Most people don't use it though, because a large family of house drakes nest up there. The unicorn keeps them around to drive off imps, but is still frustrated by the creature's willingness to pounce on guests' meals and coin purses. Moving up in the price scale, we have the Upslope House. The largest bed and breakfast in the city, it's actually large enough to qualify as an inn, though it insists that no, it's definitely not one of those because that would be illegal. The "please trust me, we're legit" defense actually does work in this situation. The place does have a few unsavory rumors about it, specifically claiming the building has some connection to caverns beneath Korvosa, home to strange creatures that will occasionally kidnap guests. The last bed and breakfast is Tenna's, the smallest and most expensive. The place doesn't just provide a bed and a breakfast, no, that's just the bare minimum. When you stay at Tenna's, you stay in the highest amount of luxury Korvosa can possibly provide. We're talking spa treatments and a variety of activities. Now over in the university section of the Heights, inns are allowed, and the Wise Dragon Inn is one of the biggest in the area. They often cater to prospective students who travel to the city on the hopes of getting into the academy or the university. The rest of the year, when there are no prospective students, business sharply drops. The Wise Dragon also offers a unique kind of, call it a service. Several imps who were formerly familiars of the academy live at the inn, offering advice to prospective students. How much you want to trust that information is up to you. I'd probably take a book instead. Once students are accepted into the school, they usually get more permanent accommodations, but they still need to eat and drink. And for those in the know, the Jittery Quill is the place to do that. It serves both ale and coffee, so if you need to wind down or wind up, here is where you want to be. It's open all hours of the day, 6 days a week, so when you need that fix, it's there. Moving away from the university to Cliffside, you have the Crested Falcon, perhaps the most expensive restaurant in Korvosa. The menu is bespoke and changes daily depending on what the staff has on hand. This is the kind of place where if you have to ask the price, you can't afford it and honestly shouldn't even be here, please leave immediately lest your poorness be contagious. Of course, you can always just order and hope you have enough to pay, though if you don't, the Crested Falcon will magically compel you to work for them until your debt is paid off. If you're unlucky, that means washing dishes and street advertising for quite a while. But if the staff feels you're up to the task, they instead send you out to hunt game, fish for jigsaw sharks, or trade for ingredients with the nomadic Varisians. But if you prefer to have cheaper drinks and a bit of danger, head on down to the Overlook, which teeters on the edge of Korvosa's sea cliffs. The place looks more and more ready to fall into the surf every year, the perfect kind of place to live on the edge. And since you already like to live dangerously, why not head inside and order their signature drink, the This and That. Created by the owner, Asa Heinrich, the This and That has no set recipe. Rather, it's mixed by using whatever liquid Asa has left over. Not just drinks or alcohol, a liquid. So dishwater is a consistent component. A disgusting slurry of slop, anyone that can finish a This and That earns free drinks for the rest of the night. Asa serves several throughout the week, but only hands out free drinks once or twice a month at most. The last location in the Heights is dedicated to the arts. The Marble Dome is owned by House Jaguar and is a resounding money sink. A play here is considered a success if it breaks even, and actors would rather head out to rural Sandpoint than put up with the abuse of the manager, Torin Palastas. A little more successful is the Kendall Amphitheater. This outdoor theater was actually constructed over a huge sinkhole that opened in the cliffside in 4579. While Korvosa does have a few naturally occurring sinkholes, this one was actually caused... well, I guess technically bug monsters eating out the foundation could still technically be considered natural. I mean, bug monsters are natural. Anyway, the point is bug monsters made this one. The city contracted an adventuring group called the Scions of Purus to clear them out. The group descended into the sinkhole and killed most of the creatures, with only one casualty, their leader of the group, Mina Kendall. Following the extermination, the city contracted dwarven engineers from Yanderhof to come and stabilize the sinkhole, as well as the underground vault it now connected to. 3 years later, the remaining Scions returned to Korvosa for the grand opening of the outdoor theater named in their leader's honor. The Kendall Amphitheater hosts a variety of performances, both play and sporting, but nothing that would draw blood. The bugs that made that sinkhole in the first place are drawn to it, and no one wants to undermine the foundations with the remnants of those bugs that still lurk underground. As a location, the Heights are not entirely indicative of Korvosa. Rather, they showcase, well, its Heights, the kind of people who are the movers and shakers around the city. If you live or work or really even exist in the Heights, you definitely aren't an ordinary, lower class or even middle class person. This is the kind of place for people who are doing things in the world. Midland. Now we've seen the extravagant high of the Heights and the low poverty of Old Korvosa, so let's look at something in between with Midland. This district has the greatest diversity of residents, from the higher class families, middle class merchants, and humble dock workers and laborers. The West Dock Ward is entirely devoted to warehouses and other businesses. To the west of the docks is the Slopes Ward, which holds quite a few libraries, museums, and other cultural sites. Farther south is Pillar Hill, which houses most of the residents of Midland, with the upper class living a little bit closer towards Castle Korvosa, and the less wealthy becoming more common the farther from the city's seat of power you get. Lastly, we have Highbridge, named for its proximity to Highbridge, the span that crosses the Jagir River and leads to East Shore. As a reminder, the river does this big swooping S-bend from here at the shore. The city, except for Old Korvosa on Endern Isle and a bit on East Shore, is all located on a small stretch of land that looks a bit like a peninsula, but by technical definition isn't, which means that Highbridge doesn't connect Korvosa to the mainland, it's already on that, it just spans the river. However, it's easy to forget that looking at this map, so I feel like a reminder was in order. The Highbridge Ward is mostly home to families of the Korvosan Guard and Sable Company, though the population is still pretty diverse. The biggest building in the district is Citadel Volshenek, named for the immortal lord who financed most of it. It's the headquarters of the Korvosan Guard as well as the city's main prison. Relatively normal on the outside, rumors persist that the lower levels lead into an underground vault that regularly floods with the Jagir River each year. Located nearby is a bar called Baylor's Retreat, where off-duty guards and recently released prisoners can go to relax after they leave the Citadel. The guard tends to prefer the place's strong coffee over any alcohol, so any brawls that break out from the recently released prisoners blowing off steam tend to get resolved pretty quickly. Personally, I think they should just let them drink in peace, but I don't control the guard. At the moment. Now, if you'd rather drink without the guard looking over your shoulder every minute, the Creaky Hammock is where you want to go. A tavern known for loud days and louder nights, it's frequently over capacity as the people who can't find a hammock just pass out on the floor. Not that sleeping stops the noise much, since anyone that didn't drink themselves unconscious is going to have a hard time getting any shut-eye through the snoring, the creaking, and just whatever other sounds people make. The biggest draw in this part of the city is the markets, which bring in goods from all across Korvosa and Varisia and peddle them to people in all walks of life. There are two markets that exist kind of right next to each other, one made of permanent shops and one of temporary market stalls. Gold Market is populated every day by vendors from all around, who sell too many things to fully list. Food stalls are pretty popular here, selling everything from sugary fried dough to fully made meals, from traditional Varisian to Vudran and Chelish imports. If you can't find it at Gold Market, it's probably illegal and you just look too much like a guard while asking. Try being less suspicious and asking again. The more permanent shops are located at Eadred's Walk. The shops here complement the Gold Market well, offering more long-term goods and services, while the stalls offer smaller crafts and foodstuffs. It's weird to think about it, since most people see them as a modern thing, but Eadred's Walk is actually a mall. The residences and buildings' upper floors create enough overhang to shelter the lower levels year-round, creating a nice covered space for people to walk and browse. We're gonna go ahead and rapid-fire the shops and see what they sell. Aram's Crown, tavern that sells weaker drinks to shoppers during the day and high-quality spirits later in the evening. Bosch's, small bookseller who sells a variety of maps, though the accuracy of them is sometimes dubious. Doom and Gloom, a shop run by a Varisian woman who does tarot readings for a price, though as you can tell by the name, they are usually tragic. Galloping Ghost, a large shop that sells riding tack and barding for a variety of mounts, including the special equipment used by the Sable Company hippogriffs. Gemshare Jewelry, it's a gem shop that sells jewelry. That's it. Hedge Wizardry, a magic shop whose owner, Phaetron Skoda, dropped out of Thalmanexus College, the other, less prestigious magic school in Korvosa. Though he sells a lot of magical paraphernalia, students of the academy and the college are both forbidden from doing business with him. Highbridge Haberdashery, they sell hats and hat-related things. Nothing super fancy, but nice enough to keep your head dry. Keps. Kep sells fish, whichever ones his cousins bring in for the day. He also has a stuffed Sadacthy sea devil in the back that many people swear they've seen move. Fairfish Bait Shop, the one-stop shop for a piece of equipment and bait for pulling tasty treats from the sea. The owner is known to love seafood, but also has a deep fear of large bodies of water, so they'll buy any freshly caught seafood at a fair price. Pinking Shears, a barber shop run by an old dromar named Hooktooth. A stylish dresser of few words, Hooktooth is considered the best barber in Korvosa and will only take new clients if a trusted one recommends them. Slicing Dicers, sells bladed weapons of all kinds, from the mundane to the magical. Known to take in gently used cutlery if you're looking to offload acquired items. Smoked Foods. I mean, do I have to tell you what they sell here? Okay, there's one neat thing though. Twice a year, Shawanti hunters will bring in huge predatory beasts called land sharks, which they will smoke directly outside the shop to sell. Time Stop, a watch shop owned by a gnome named Gobi Kapabapple. Every clock in the shop is set to the exact same time, something he calibrates every week with his daughters Min and Sek. His wife said tick and tock were too obvious. Note, they don't set it to the accurate time, just a random same time. Trapper's Hole. Jope Chancemo is a retired Sable Company Marine who sells hunting supplies, mostly archery related. Jope is something of a purist and won't sell or work on crossbows. And that's Eadred's Walk, but not every shop in the city is located here. Farther north, closer to the university section of the Heights, we have Bookmaker, Korvosa's largest bookshop. Students from the university flock here to purchase from the massive selection that Kostas Saramas, the proprietor, has to offer. He has something of a gentleman's agreement with the Gilded Orrery to avoid purchasing books with overlapping topics, which means Bookmaker mostly covers non-magical subjects. Recently, Costa has been putting up flyers for anyone around the city who can examine the shop for ghosts, which he swears he hears at night. The clerics of Pharasma have checked the place out and declared it clear, but I mean, it's not like they specialize in the undead or anything. The last shop we're going to cover is definitely the most interesting. Pestico's Dolls and Figurines is run by an old man named Vadid Pestico. For years, he and his wife Christy made exquisite dolls and figurines for the children of the city while lamenting their own lack of kids. 10 years ago, Christy tragically passed away, leaving Vadid alone. The loss spurred him to undertake a highly ambitious project of magical craftsmanship. Recently, he revealed 6 animated and expertly crafted ball-jointed dolls. Calling them his daughters, they now work the shop with him, bringing in more customers than he's seen in decades. Though one of them has recently gone missing. Probably unrelated to the string of missing people from the streets. Yeah, definitely unrelated. Lastly, we have one of the most important landmarks in Korvosa, and one that any overland visitor is likely to see when they enter the city proper. Eadred's Square creates a prominent landmark in Midland, making for an excellent meeting place for visitors and locals alike. Just like Midland itself, Eadred's Square is a big mixing bowl of people, from the high to the low, both coming and going, all moving through Korvosa on a variety of businesses. Midland is definitely Korvosa's biggest melting pot. It takes almost everything from the city and combines it all together in a single district, showing off local color and the variety of people that call Korvosa home. East Shore. But let's cross that bridge and enter East Shore, the only part of the city on that side of the channel of the Jagera River. The second smallest district of the city, at least by my estimation, East Shore is pretty sparsely populated compared to the rest of the city. It's not even big enough to have separate wards, it's just one area, so there's comparatively little to cover with this one. North of East Shore is an unofficial tent city that's mostly occupied by Varisian caravans and Shawanti hunters that reluctantly do business with the city. This area is kind of dubiously within Korvosa's limits, and a lot of the people in the city will avoid it unless they absolutely have business there, while the people in the camps will avoid interacting with the city outside of their business necessities. The biggest legitimate draw of East Shore is the Thalmonexus College. It's a smaller wizard school, much less prestigious and famous than the Academy. In fact, the Academy looks down on it and doesn't even really consider it a rival school, rather a second-place school for losers. Thalmonexus considers discretion to be the better part of valor. Prior to becoming a school, it was a manor house belonging to House Galder, who were expelled from the city following the Cousins' War. It changed hands several times before 4603, when a newly hired teacher at the Academy named Yaris Verso purchased it. After House Thrun's rise seemed to shift the Academy's curriculum, Verso donated the manor to some colleagues and left Korvosa. Now, Thalmonexus has spent the last 100-ish years establishing themselves as a worthy rival to the Academy. The college has 3 different buildings. The old manor is Verso Hall, which holds the administrative offices and a few classrooms. Torrier Hall, named for one of Verso's apprentices, holds 5 classrooms. But the most interesting is Gieselbottle Hall. Financed by the gnome Tempest Gieselbottle, a close friend of Verso and the only founding member remaining alive, the original plan had the hall built entirely to his gnomish proportions. Partway through construction, it was pointed out to him that Korvosa is a largely human city, and most other ancestries on Galarian are similarly proportioned to humans, so it would probably make more sense to build to that size. However, they were already halfway done, and why waste the work? So half the building is built for humans, and the other half is built to gnomish and halfling proportions. As a result, that half of the building sees much less use. Guess you could say it has a much smaller percentage of use. Haha. Now, East Shore's only inn is Leftovers, run by a one-armed retired soldier named Portenas Gascalini. He loves to tell the story of how he lost his arm to a Shawanti in battle, to the point where his old army buddies will stop by about twice a month to reenact it for the inn's patrons. If you don't need lodging and just want drinks, you can head over to Shoreline Drink Hall, one of the few taverns in East Shore. It has a reputation for good drinks and bland food, as well as the occasional short brawl. It brings in a lot of people from the city, as well as the travelers from the camp outside the walls, like the Varisians and traveling Shawanti. To end on a boring note, the last notable location in East Shore is the Horse Shop. It sells horses, but also other riding and pack animals like donkeys, mules, ponies, a camel once and twice, you know how it goes. And that's it. East Shore doesn't actually have a lot going for it. It feels pretty disconnected from the rest of Korvosa, kind of in a similar way to Old Korvosa, but not with the same level of rundown poverty. It's on the edge of the city, across the river from everything else, and has no real draw. But based on location, if Korvosa ever started expanding, East Shore would be the front line for it. Southern Korvosa. The last district of the city is Southern Korvosa, which can be further divided into South Shore and the Grey. We'll start with the Grey because it's dead easy to describe, because it's the graveyard, you see. Divided into 4 smaller wards, each hold graves for different people from different classes and walks of life. For those who can't afford a proper bespoke burial, Potter's Ward serves as a mass grave. Moving up is Everyman's Ward, where most of Korvosa's dead are buried. It also has an opening into 2 underground vaults that exist side by side under the Grey. One is an ancient Shoanti burial site, while the other leads to several ossuaries filled with bones. The Gold Ward is reserved for the nobility, the monarchy, and the leaders of the Sable Company and Korvosan Guard. It hosts dozens of mausoleums and crypts with dead family members stretching back generations. While all graveyards have a chance to produce undead, this ward has a tendency to produce the kind that retain their intelligence. Now you probably think that undead are a problem that cities would want taken care of, and you'd be correct. The Church of Pharasma does their best to resolve this, and it's why the city's Grand Cathedral of Pharasma is located in the final ward, the Sepulchre Ward. Various clerics and champions have been interred here, along with allegedly the bones of Saint Alika. The clerics here take their duty seriously and have fought off sieges from undead that arose from the graveyards around them, keeping the rest of the city safe. Personally, I think they should be spending more time trying to figure out why the undead seem to rise so easily here, but that's just me. The only other place of note in the Grey is the Great Tomb of Leadership in the Gold Ward, which houses the bodies of past military leaders and highly decorated soldiers. At all times, 1 soldier from the Guard and 1 Marine from the Sable Company must guard the front of the tomb, while a second pair of them patrol the nearby area for looters or undead. They are required to remain within 50 feet of the tomb at all times, no matter what. Though they can aid the Pharasman clerics with ranged attacks if needed, they are otherwise duty-bound to remain at the tomb. This guard duty is considered to be a great honor for any service members chosen for it. Now, South Shore is the newest district added to Korvosa, specifically established by Queen Domina when she began construction of the Pantheon of the Many. Prior to this area's construction, the Grey was considered the entirety of southern Korvosa, which also explains the whole wall between them that you can see. The area is now mostly populated by the newly wealthy, the kind of people unassociated with the older houses, but wealthy enough for poor people to have to listen to them. The biggest building and biggest draw is still the Pantheon that Queen Domina had built. It took until 4706 to fully complete. Originally, the location had shrines to 15 of Galarian's 20 major deities. The missing 5 were Caden Kalian, Desna, Gorum Lamashtu, and Rovagug. However, a few days after it opened, the clerics of Caden and Desna protested in such large numbers that the caretakers of the Pantheon couldn't leave the building. Their gods were added in immediately. Beyond that, most of the draws in South Shore are higher-end shops. The cheapest place you'll find is Bard's End, a large inn that caters to various traveling actors and bards that come to perform at Kendall Amphitheater. It has a small stage to allow the guests to practice or show off, and not a night goes by that doesn't have a few people take the stage. For those looking for a more social experience, the Jade Circle provides several options. During the day, it serves a variety of teas from across the world to noble women and their daughters. As the sun goes down, the clientele shifts to young men drinking spirits and mulled wine while debating the most serious of topics, like which weapons are the coolest. Apparently it's currently rapier and dagger. For purchasing goods, the Green Market is the place to go. It's actually recently reopened, having closed a decade ago when the owner died. It was purchased by a woman named Ziva Foxglove and reopened 4 years ago. The place has become very successful, selling foods, clothing, commodities, jewelry, and other luxuries. The only thing it doesn't sell is weapons, armor, or anything magical. Though if you need a live animal, you're better off headed to Orcado's Feathers and Fur, a small shop run by an elderly halfling who used to serve a Magnamaran lord as his hunt master before retiring to Korvosa. He peddles in a variety of animals, both mundane and exotic. And that's all the main draws for southern Korvosa and all the districts of Korvosa as a whole. However, we're not quite done yet. We have 2 more things to talk about, one above and one below. Korvosa is a city with limited room to expand outward, but that doesn't stop people from needing new places to live and work. So they decided to take a page from Karamaga and go up. This has resulted in a crisscrossing network of lean-tos, shacks, and a variety of constructions on top of the more stable older buildings. They aren't on every rooftop, and most don't entirely connect, so mapping them is almost impossible. The Shingles, as they are now called, started life in Bridgefront, and the portion there is the most built up and the most dangerous. No one is building to proper codes here after all, and the foundations are not stable. Sections here can collapse on a whim and are as often home to rooftop predators as they are to the humans that built them. The sections here connect to Garrison Hill and Old Korvosa, though they are far less extensive due to lower building density. The steepness of the hill's rise also makes them more vertical than average, with lots of ramps and ladders. The sprawl is also spread down to the Old Docks Ward, though it stops quickly before reaching the warehouses. Down in Cliffside and Pillar Hill, a similar level of density led to the locals in the area taking to the rooftops for travel, emulating the movements of the less fortunate in Old Korvosa's poorer districts. As time went on, this grew to the point that the Midlands and the Heights have their own version of the Shingles. A similar phenomena occurred in the Midlands High Bridge and West Docks, where the Shingles take on an almost nautical theme. Located among the tangled rooftop dwellings are people from all walks of life, including their very own bartender. Twitchers is run by a red-headed man named Ramthos, who mixes up strong drinks in what many consider to be the Shingles' only truly permanent building. Where exactly it's located is something of a secret test. If you're the kind of person who can drink there, you'll find it. Now heading down, Korvosa is built atop an extensive system of underground caves, collectively called vaults. There are 3 broad categories these fall into. The first are the hollow Shoanti burial mounds, sacred sites where they interred their dead. When the Chelish moved in, they showed absolutely zero respect for these spaces, digging connecting ditches and turning the resulting tunnels into the city's sewer system. The metaphor is as rancid as it is apt. The nature of these tunnels means that Korvosa's sewer system is seemingly built at random. The second kind of vault is naturally existing sea caves. These irregular caverns go deep beneath the surface, some possibly connecting to the Darklands. Because of the coastal nature of the city, these are mostly sea caves and will regularly flood and empty, adding to the erosion effect and opening new sinkholes in the city as they become unstable. Finally, on the southern end of the city, a few worked tunnels of unknown origin have been found. Two of them seem to just stretch a few hundred feet before ending, while one opens into a chamber in the Pantheon of the Many. Who built them and why isn't known, but if I had to take a guess, I'd say they're Thessalonian in nature, which never bodes well. And with that, we've covered the entirety of Korvosa. Its history, its geography, and its culture. The city has just recently turned 300 years old, which is very young in the grand scheme of things, but it has a lot of history to it. It's gonna have even more soon enough, as the aging King Eadred struggles to conceive an heir with his young and not particularly interested queen. Iliosa has her own plans for the city, none of which bode well. She's an ambitious young woman, eager to take the crown and very eager to bear her fangs. Looming above their head is the so-called curse that afflicts all who sit on the Crimson Throne. There's tension and plots bubbling beneath the surface of Korvosa, and it will only take a little bit more heat to get that pot boiling over. As I've said before in other videos, there's always more to explore in these places, but I think we've done enough for now, Pathfinders. Any other secrets the city has will have to be explored later because we will return to Korvosa properly when we kick off Curse of the Crimson Throne. Thank you so much for watching the video and putting up with my somewhat raspy voice. The script kinda got away from me a bit as I kept finding more and more things to add, and then I happened to get COVID, so the production has been rocky. Please remember to do all the YouTube like and subscribe things, it really helps out so much, and please share the video if you like it. Reminder that I have reopened the Patreon if you feel like being generous, and until next time, Pathfinders, explore, report, and cooperate.